So welcome everybody. Thank you for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to talk about these issues. Although as long as you start investing more in this kind of issues, the more you understand that it's a whole world to discover, and you're always learning new things. So I don't like the word expert a lot because of that. I think when you think you're an expert, then you realize maybe you still need to learn something else. So it's also important to keep this in mind, that we are never totally experts on anything, and we always need to keep our minds open to learn new things. So as Brigitte mentioned, we have Slido that we're going to use 2 or 3 times across this session. So you can join them by using this QR code with your phone, or you can also go to slido.com if you have any trouble with that. And here we have already the first question being answered. With which region are you from? And we can see Emilia Romagna and a big number of people, and Romania also. And then, well, we have lots of Italians in the room, also from Salzburg and Austria, and Navarra, Spain, Catalonia, Ireland, Poland, Turkey, so many parts of the world. Otimis, Barcelona, Donegal. Okay, Brussels, of course. Okay, it's growing. Italy, it's growing. I can see we have lots of Italians in the room from different regions. Okay, interesting. So I can see you're accessing Slido. If you have any troubles accessing Slido, just please, connect with us in the chat, and we will help you. So this is a bit what we're going to use it for, to interact a bit, because we are too many people, so it's hard to interact in any other way besides using Slido. In the end, we're going to have a small space for questions also. So if you have any questions, just type it along the way in Slido, and in the end, I will leave a bit of room to answer your questions if you have any more specific questions, okay? So I'll just start sharing the PowerPoint. Okay, so just to summarize what we're going to talk about today, we're talking about interculturalism, and then this is disformatted, sorry about that. And then intercultural competence training. What does it mean? How can it be done? And some tips for reflection on the issue, and how can we organize intercultural competence training. So just to start a bit on the issue of interculturalism and what is interculturalism. So I think it's always a good basis to start from. I know many of you probably have heard the term already, and some of you might already also know a bit more about the issue. But just so I think this graph is always interesting to really see the differences between different approaches to diversity. And one is the guest worker approach that basically neglects diversity, and it's an economic, if it's seen from the economic point of view, this conviviality between different cultural backgrounds. When we talk about assimilation, we talk about rejecting and diversity, and our goal mostly is that everyone kind of behaves the same way, has the same kind of values, the same kind of life. So assimilation is what it means. I mean, that people become more similar to the majority when they arrive. And multiculturalism is something that has been the tendency for the past years, which is when we come from assimilation, but we start overemphasizing diversity. So we do have lots of people that are different living in the same place, but they don't necessarily relate to each other, and don't necessarily exchange or see each other as equally valuable for the society. And sometimes is a bit when we overemphasize diversity as something exotic, something that is very different from me, but it's never going to be as good as what I do. It's just something exotic, something that I might appreciate occasionally, as food or when going to a show, but it's not the same. It's not the same as interconnecting with this different approach to life and to values, and that in a more equal way. So when we become truly intercultural is when we value what each person brings to the table as the same way as what I bring to the table. So it's when we look at every contribution as being equal, being equally important, and being equally valuable for our society, and making up part of our society as another piece of the puzzle and not something that doesn't fit in the puzzle. So is when we really, and this is only possible when we create intercultural interaction, which is one of the key principles of interculturalism, is really when there's relationship between different groups, people interact, people feel and understand their interdependence. So this significant relationship is something that is crucial and is particular to interculturalism. So this is why we sometimes have a multicultural society, but we aim to make it intercultural. So we want to give this leap between everyone living in the same place being different to actually valuing this diversity and putting people in connection to each other. The main principles of interculturalism are four. I could say that there are four. I mean, it has been evolving, this concept, a long time. And it's about equality. It's about, fundamental rights and everyone having equal treatment, equal opportunities, and being the discrimination being absent from our society. It's about meaningful interaction. Also, when we create condition for people to have a positive everyday cross-cultural encounters and to develop a we culture, not us and them. So everyone is part of the same society. We can say we are all Portuguese, we're all Scandinavian, whatever we want to say, but not that there's us and them, those that are more Portuguese and those that are less Portuguese. So when we become this we culture, then we create a true interactive and intercultural place. This the diversity advantage is also a very important approach to that is part of interculturalism, which is to really recognize and acknowledge the value of diversity. And I always stress this out because it's not the same as saying, oh yeah, yes, diversity is important, but then we don't really make use of it, and we really don't plan our strategy as a region or a city, taking into account this advantage that diversity brings. So it needs to be something that is valuable not only in my speech, but also in my actions, the way I plan, the way I look at the city, the kind of citizens I listen to when I'm planning to. So it really needs to, and of course, that I always say that, becoming more inclusive or more intercultural, of course, it's a lot of work and more conflict might arise because we might be listening to many different people with many different views on what they think the city or the region should be like. So, of course, there's this part where we will have more conflict. The conflict is a positive thing when it's well managed. So it needs to be something that we look at positively too. This enlargement of conflict means we have more people with different views, which is good, and that they feel comfortable enough bringing their views to us. And this is also very important. And this is about participation too. So when we ensure that there's some level of power sharing, we cannot create an inclusive environment without power sharing, because we will never know from our perspective, from our very limited perspective, what it is to be in everyone's shoes. So we really need to engage people, not only by listening to people, but really engage them in the solutions they feel they need for their quality of life. So to really create an intercultural place, we need to have access to citizenship, to education, to public services, to the labor market, to the cultural life. And everything needs to be equitable. People need to feel that the governance and institutions are designed for these culturally diverse communities and are managed in a way that is culturally sensitive. And this is why intercultural competence is important, because if we didn't have the time or the chance to reflect about these issues, it would be harder for us to understand that the needs of everyone, they might be so different from mine, are being tackled by my policies and by my plans, my strategic plans. So we really need to step a bit outside our shoes and to be able to understand a bit what is going around us and the many different perspectives on what quality of life might mean. So it's very important also to keep in mind that we will never really know what it is to be in someone else's shoes. So this is why we need these other people by our side, because it's impossible for us with our own lives, our own histories, to be able to fully understand what another person is going through. And participation can really bridge the gap between my knowledge and my perception of reality or of everyone's needs and what really people need. And to start, I also like to reflect a bit on this issue of what is culture. And this is very important because it's a first step for us to understand how complex our issue is when we want to create an intercultural society. It's not something that it can be done by very simple and strict policies. It's something that needs to be very flexible, because the reality is that culture is not homogeneous. We cannot say that there's a limit, a very fixed limit between different cultures. This really doesn't exist. In Portugal, we have a very traditional scarf that was brought from Russia, and actually the word tea was that's such a famous thing in the UK is called tea because the Portuguese were there and the boxes had a tea on it. And so when we think about this, is very cultural. From this culture, like all the English like to drink tea, it's not just an English thing. So it's something that it can be cross-cutting several cultures. So the limits are not that fixed. And we cannot really say that many times, oh, they do this because it's their culture. You have to be a bit careful of that. And that also that culture is independent and cannot be changed. And it's something that is outside human action. Culture is made by people. It's something we as humans invented. So culture is something that can change and has changed across time. And it doesn't mean, of course, that change cannot be forced. And we will see that in a minute when we talk about ethnocentrism. But we can see them as something that is plastic, that it involves, and not everyone in the same place will live their cultural background the same way because of that, because it's involving and engaging in interaction. And culture is not uniform, as I said before. Not all members of the same group, or they might all feel belonging to the same cultural group, but they might not live it in the same way. So they might not express it in their daily lives the same way. So it's also very important, because sometimes we do generalizations without realizing, and expect a certain person that comes from Japan to like anime cartoons just because they come from Japan. And it's not everyone lives the same culture the same way. So it's very important to also keep this in mind. And then no person has only one cultural influence. We all have, especially nowadays in a globalized world, where we have access to cultural references from all over the world. I mean, we can never be influenced by only one reference, only one specific cultural reference. If we start thinking about it, many of the things we do today in our daily lives, maybe someone across the Atlantic does exactly the same thing every day. So we do need to question a bit because sometimes we close people in boxes, like they belong to this culture, so we expect X things from that group of people. So we need to be careful on that, and to really connect with people, leaving space for them to show their identities independently of their several belongings, because we might be surprised that their identities might be very different from our idea of what their belongings should be like. And this brings us to the concept of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. And this is very important when we talk about interculturalism, because as I said before, we never know what it is to be in someone else's shoes. And we as humans have a tendency, and this is not because we're bad people, we all have a tendency, our brain works that way, but we all have a tendency to think that our way of functioning, our way of thinking is best than the other people's way of thinking or doing things. This is something that is, of course, our education, and our history has taught us many things, and we lived in several groups and contexts that made us think the way we think today. But that's not the only way to think about things and to act in our daily lives. And it's not very easy sometimes, if we think about how the world works, to draw the line between right and wrong, normal and normal, true, false, good or bad. And sometimes this is a false division. Of course, there's a limit, and we can talk about that. But the fact is that most of human interaction, unless we're talking about harmful behavior of others, of course, but most of human interaction is not that easy to divide into this spectrum of good and bad, true or false, and to just put them in one way or the other. Ethnocentrism is the tendency we have to judge other cultural backgrounds or other cultural behaviors as good or bad, right or wrong, normal or normal, because we're doing it from our own ethnocentric perspective, our own world, and the way we were brought up, and our lives and our histories are very limited. They close us sometimes in a very specific way of thinking about the world. And when we meet people that have totally different behaviors or cultural backgrounds, it might be hard for us to understand exactly what that means and why that happens, because we are closed in our own histories, in our own experiences. And we didn't have the chance to really, we never went through the same experience as that person. So it's hard for us to understand where that comes from and why is that important for another person. So this can very easily lead to judgments and the notion of hierarchy, of cultural evolutionist theories, and the linear version of progress. And it's also very important because sometimes we use the term developed countries and non-developed countries, or countries that are under development, very easily. And this can be very tricky and can be very judgmental because it comes from a perspective of what developed means, that it's my perspective. It is not exactly all the visions of development. So, for example, when the Portuguese colonized Brazil, there were Brazilians living there already. We didn't discover anything. On the contrary, as we say in schools, we learned that the Portuguese were discoveries. We didn't discover anything. It was already there. We just didn't know. And when we went there, people were living there. We had tribes living in Brazil. And the way they connected to nature can be seen as development. But we arrived there and we looked at it from our ethnocentric perspective, and we thought that this was undeveloped and they needed to be developed as we think developed means. And so with doing that, we ended up neutralizing much of the knowledge that existed in these tribes as being undeveloped, and by not valuing it, by not reinforcing it, by not using it, by not learning from the native Brazilians that we met, we were being ethnocentric. We were saying, no, what we know best is better. What we think the world should be and how we should behave is better than the way you behave. And we didn't really connect them in the cultural way, where we saw what they were bringing the same way, as important as what we were bringing to the table. So this is, of course, colonialism is a very extreme experience, but I think it can highlight how this sometimes can happen in a less extreme way in our daily lives. And that might lead to not horizontal connection. So if we don't leave our ethnocentric perspective a bit, it's hard to connect to people that are very different from me in a more intercultural way. So this is why this concept is important. Cultural relativism, on the other hand, is to understand that there's no norm. Cultural references can be very different, and my cultural reference is not a norm. So there's different norms for different cultural references or different cultural backgrounds, and ultimately for each person, because each person might have so many different cultural backgrounds, influences, that they might have a totally different norm that I will have, or any other people living next door will have. So cultural relativism also makes us think that there's no cultural hierarchy. There's no culture that is more developed or better than others. And there's space for different perspectives on the definition of norm, of moral values, and the notion that each society can only be understood from within. So it's important to have context And I cannot really judge another cultural background or another cultural setting without being immersed into it from the outside. So I need to listen. And that's why, again, why participation is very important. So as Chimamanda Adichie says, culture does not make people, people make culture. So if it's true that full humanity of women, for example, is not our culture, then we should change the culture. And so this is where we talk about where we draw the line between relativism, saying, okay, so if a certain group thinks that killing children is okay, then we should accept it. Maybe not. But because we have, this is why we as several countries, not all countries of the world, but several countries of, and several in Europe also, we have a human rights declaration, because the Human Rights Declaration, what it means is to set the boundaries to relativism. You know, we can accept many things, but there are things we together, at least some groups of countries, found that could not be crossed. Even by accepting everything, some things might not be acceptable. So this is why it's important for us also to understand relativism is important, but of course there are lines. These lines are not consensual. So even to be, even for what we might think is very basic, which is Human Rights Declaration, even that is not consensual. So we can see how complex this issue is of how we think about things, because when someone in China reads a declaration of human rights, they might read something completely different than what was my intention by writing it. So it's very, very intense. It has to be a lot of listening and negotiation and reflection together and mutual understanding to really understand why is that country reads a different thing from that declaration. I really admire people that are in this process of negotiation, because it's really, really important and not very easy. So the key principles of an intercultural integration policy is to really, as I mentioned before, you know, to have this diversity advantage, to have this connection between people that is not an ethnocentric one, you know, that is a real connection between, a horizontal connection. And of course that we need to create some common values in the sense that we need to agree on how we're going to relate to each other and what is the baseline for our connection. And this means that we need to really look at the diversity advantage in a way that we really value everyone's opinions to the table. And we need to develop expertise and skills to be able to do this. This is something that it doesn't really come naturally most of the times. Sometimes we need to develop our skills to be able to create this bridge between people and to really make them connect and listen to each other in a less ethnocentric perspective. Regarding society and territory, it means like building intercultural competence, not only in our staff, but in everyone living in the city, or in the region. That's the ideal scenario. And this is why the ICC created the Intercultural Competence test, which is an online survey where people can take it and have some feedback on how intercultural they might be. And of course, participation, co-creation, opportunities for interaction and power sharing are very important, because if we all have a tendency to be ethnocentric, then we need to fight this tendency by listening, by bringing people together to create solutions. And this relationship can be created by an inclusive culture, but also having in mind this intersectionality aspect, because as I said, no person is only one thing, is only connected to one cultural reference. So we need to keep in mind that the same person might be subject to different types of discrimination, for example, because of their several belongings. If I'm a woman with a disability that is also LGBTI, I will suffer different aspects than another woman that might be white or more educated, for example. So not all women from the same cultural background will have the same experience, not only because they might live their cultural backgrounds in different ways, but because they might have other characteristics that make their lives totally different from the other woman next door that might be very similar on the outside. So it's very important that we do realize when we listen to people, if we have representatives from different groups, and different. For example, when here in Lisbon, we had a big community of Nepalis arriving a few years ago, and the municipality started working with Nepalis. And it was very interesting because only after a few years, we realized we were working only with a high caste Nepalis. And so the lower caste Nepalis were not feeling recognized in the policies and projects that were being made, and they didn't feel like they were welcomed or that their needs were being met by the policies, because the policies were thought about high caste Nepalis, so people that had another different resources and different advantages and different privileges. And so it's very important that we understand that we know no Nepali will represent all Nepalis, no woman will represent all women. And if we have this in mind, we might have a different concern in having sitting at the table different layers within the same groups. And we need to cultivate this openness to change, not only from ourselves, but from everyone else within the region. For example, we have a big discussion here in Portugal regarding bullfights, because bullfights is supposed to be our culture. There are groups saying no one moves, no one changes our culture, this is forbidden. And other groups saying, no, our culture can and must change. And so these discussions and this openness to change and to reflect that maintaining certain traditions doesn't have to mean that these traditions cannot be adjusted to other times and other reflections and other needs, because we're having more generations that are very concerned with animal rights. So our society is changing, and we need to be open to these conversations. The conflict management, as I mentioned before, is also very important to create an intercultural place. We need to be aware that as we give voice to more diverse voices, more conflict of interests will arise, and we will need to be able to create spaces where this can be debated, and we can create a common understanding on what things mean, and we can create negotiation, and we can arrive to a place that's different than before, but a bit more close to what everyone needs. And it's not always easy, because people might need very different things. As in this example, we might have people that feel very offended by the fact that we end bullfights, and other people might be very offended by the fact that we continue bullfights. So how can we create a dialogue around this issue where we can find consensus or find at least a course of action that everyone kind of feels it's respectful? So intercultural regions, step by step, I just as Nicholas said, I think it makes perfect sense. The step-by-step guide that you received, it can be totally adjusted to regions. I think the only difference here is, of course, the level of decision-making is different, and the numbers are different also. And regions are a group of several cities, and the city is a more local, very specific, everyday, closer relationship. But as a region, you might also think that you have a power of influence also over several cities and several local authorities. And so you also can set certain values, you can also set some certain reflections within the group of cities that might be part of a certain region. So it's a different level, but the questions remain the same. Are we creating enough spaces for interaction, for diverse groups to belong? If we create how we call ghettos for different groups, and if they don't have a connection and they don't interact in their daily lives, they will not be able to create this intercultural perception. It's very important also because, as we know, many times cities are very oppressed sometimes by what they call public opinion. And it's important to have this in mind because, of course, we know cities the people that lead the cities are elected by people. And so public opinion is important, of course, for our elections and to be re-elected and to be able to make the difference we want to make in the city or in the region. But the fact is that sometimes if we don't create spaces for interaction, public opinion that will be more inclusive will not be able to exist, because if we don't connect to people, it's hard for us to have a more inclusive approach. I have an example also here in Lisbon, where there was a big movement of relocation, what we call social housing projects, where people were taken from improvised houses with no conditions that were made by people themselves into buildings that were built by the city with the European funds. And there was this specific neighborhood was created in a way that they had one building for people that were relocated and had what we call lower rents because of the social housing project. And then the next building was people that bought their houses with loans from the bank, medium class, and upper medium class. And it was very interesting because the idea was that people living, the next building would be more able to interact. But that actually didn't happen because it's not just enough to put people in the same neighborhood. What happened is that people from medium high class, they went within their garages with their cars and in and out. Their kids were in different schools, private schools or schools outside that area, and they went to different restaurants. So they didn't meet anywhere, not in schools, not in restaurants or cafes or even in the streets. And so this, although this was a good idea, something else was needed to really promote interaction in a daily basis. So when we do this kind of policies, we need to understand that this is not very easy because people will have very different lives. So we need to create moments and spaces, and maybe we need to have local activators that will help create engagement. For example, in the project I worked with, what we did was just created projects that after a participatory survey, we created projects that we knew would be interesting for both sides of the neighborhood, so that they will be meeting in that project activities at least, and they started making connections to each other and starting understanding each other and really feeling like they were neighbors. So access is also very important. Everyone needs to have access to opportunities and to services and to develop their potential. And access might, sometimes when I talk to public services, it's very interesting because they always say, no, but my service is for everyone. I have my open doors to everyone. But there are lots of invisible barriers for people to access services. Some might be language, but some might be even more invisible. It might be that my staff has some kind of prejudice towards a certain group. And when this group comes, we're always attending them, but in a way that they understand we're not available for their needs. We call this micro-discrimination. So small things that people say, the way they talk, the way they don't pay attention to what I'm saying, or they are always in a hurry, or they're just sighing like, or something like this. These things happen a lot. And we have lots of people, for example, here in Portugal, we understood this happened a lot for Roma people. Most public services have the perception that Roma people were going to the service that's just to take advantage of the services, and were lying. And this was a big prejudice that existed. And so when Roma people came to the services, the way they were listened to was not the same as other people. So access has very, very many layers. We're not talking about, of course, that I'm sure no public service will refuse receiving someone from a Roma community. I'm sure of that. So it's not that level of discrimination. Sometimes it's another level of discrimination that people might feel that their needs are not being attended to properly. And so they sometimes give up going to the services and using their rights because of that. So power sharing is also very important, as we mentioned before, engaging people from diverse origins in decision making. Many cities or regions have decided to have intercultural assemblies where they gather many different people to discuss certain issues before finishing a policy, for example, or a strategy. They have this consultative committee to reflect on the issues and reflect on, of course, it's very important also to reflect on the consequences that certain policy might have for different groups that sometimes are not foreseen because of my ethnocentric perspective. So I might find a policy very inclusive, and then I go talk to people, and it turns out it's not that inclusive, at least for certain groups. And so it's very important to have this kind of forums, but please do always remember no one person represents the whole community. And sometimes these assemblies, they crystallize over time. It's always the same people being listened to, and we're not listening to different perspectives within the same groups. For example, in the disability area, this is very common. A person using a wheelchair doesn't have totally the same needs as a blind person. So sometimes we have one person with disability and we think we have enough voice of the disabled people, but we don't. So we need to understand different realities within the same groups. And we need to build on an inclusive narrative. This is very important. We need to have intentionally a positive narrative about diversity. This cannot be something we leave in to chance. It needs to be something built intentionally. We need to reflect on our messages. And also, we might need to reflect on not so positive impact our message might have that wasn't intentional, because it happens a lot that sometimes a politician, for example, is doing a public speech and is very well intentioned, but sometimes it says something can be very offensive to a determined group. This happens because there is no connection probably with these groups, and we didn't have enough time to listen to all of this and to understand why these words or these terms might be offensive. Intercultural competence is also very important, as we mentioned, to build this not only on the contact with the audience level, but also in all levels of a region or a city, including decision makers and top management of organizations. And then we need to show commitment. And this is also very important. It's not enough just my speeches, but my speeches, of course, are important, but my actions, and both need to be done intentionally. So this is not something sometimes people say, but it's obvious. We're very inclusive. It's obvious. We should not leave this at the obvious level, because it's not obvious for everyone. So obvious is a very, it can be very ethnocentric too, because what's obvious for me might not be obvious for other people. And some people really need, especially when people were subject to discrimination many times, they need to listen to some certain things being said in a very direct way, so they really know it's safe. Okay, so this place is a safe place to be. For example, I know people that were discriminated in a job hunt for being LGBTI. And so they really need to see in the ad of, an employment vacancy, they need to see written there in full letters, they don't discriminate LGBTI. And even though they will be scared to go sometimes if they have a very bad experience. And it needs to be written there, because if it's not, then I might think, okay, I will have the same experience I had before. So in being intentional in the way we talk about and we show commitment is very important, being very bluntly in the way we show this commitment too. And then, of course, that in conflict management. It's very important that we don't approach interculturalism also in a very naive way, saying, oh, no, we'll put everyone together, everything will go perfectly, everyone will go along very well. Sometimes this happens, but sometimes it doesn't. And because we are, as we put many different people in the same place, conflict is bound to happen, because we will have different views on the world. We'll have different views on, everything. And so we might need to have these spaces for development and for mutual listening, and to find common ground on issues that are important for the region. The ICC index, as Nicola mentioned, is very interesting, and I think it can also be adjusted to a region level. So I think it might worth taking a look to the survey itself, because I think it's very interesting. It covers all of these fields of action that are important in a city, and I'm guessing also in a region. I've never worked very closely with regions. In Portugal, we don't have a much big experience with regions. We only have 2 autonomous regions. The others are not autonomous. And so we don't have that much experience maybe as other countries. But I'm guessing that much of this is also policy level and reflection level at the region level. So it's about, all of these areas, and they're all interconnected, of course, but sometimes the policies are made in a very sectorial way and not in an intersectional way. And so someone's thinking about a policy or project in education might not have a full view of what's happening in business and labor or in welcoming policies, and they are all interconnected. So the invitation of the index is also, sometimes I used to say the index is an excuse to put everyone at the same table within a city or a region. So everyone working in those so different policies has a chance now to sit together and reflect how they are tackling interculturalism in a cross-sectoral way, in a cross-cutting way over the organization. And this is very important, because my welcoming policies will influence the way education can or not, or will or not be able to really be more inclusive. And so they're all interconnected and must be seen in that way. I know it's not very easy, because sometimes we have so much work, and some organizations have more culture of meeting everyone than others. And I've met many cities that never met colleagues from other departments, and so we know that it's not very easy, but it's something that might be important once in a while to really, for interculturalism, it's very important because a person might feel very inclusive in the education level, very included in the education level, but then not at the business and labor, and so we're not tackling everything. So just leaving some space for inspiration. What are some cities doing that might be interesting, and regions too that might be interesting? Unfortunately, Portugal doesn't have much of this practices yet. I'm hoping for some of them soon, and there's a discussion about some of them soon also. Because to really reach this reparation or restoration field, and here we are talking mostly about slavery and colonialism, but this applies to other issues too, other groups too. But for example, in Portugal, there has been a lack of recognition in the sense of acknowledging the harmful that was created from our colonial past. And so in an official, and as I said, there might exist some recognition, but it's not done in an official, obvious and bluntly way. So that, for example, our school books are still very light when they talk about this issue, and they talk about in this very ethnocentric perspective of us, Portuguese, the conquerors, the discoverers, and not in a perspective of all the bad things that happened, and all the consequences that it still has in some people nowadays. Because first we need to acknowledge that there are parts of our history that are not beautiful. They existed, they had bad consequences and had maybe not very good paths, and now we're looking at it from a perspective from human rights reflection, and we know it's something we don't want to repeat again. And so we need to acknowledge that, so that we want to then start thinking about how can we create social justice, because social justice can only be achieved when we realize that not everyone comes from the same place regarding opportunities and privilege, because of this history also. And so after that, we can start thinking about how reparation can happen. And there's some examples. For example, some regions or countries are doing surveys and collecting memories of slavery, creating sometimes museums and books because most of this history has not been registered, because most of the slaves could not write or didn't have a chance to collect their own experiences at the time. And so many of these things were lost. And how can we honor their history too, by acknowledging the importance of what happened, and why is it not in museums and in books the same way other parts of history are? So, for example, Utrecht created the Black Archives, and it's has endured a very, very interesting path of collecting all of these other histories of the Netherlands history. And this recognition of other histories is also very important. For example, the alteration of street names, creating new statues instead of just the same that already existed. For example, here in Portugal, we still have statues that celebrate people that were also enslavers. And so this has been very polemic during the Black Lives Movement. And the reflection was when we really create and bridge dialogue, then we can think, okay, so if there are parts of the population that don't want to bring down statues, but they are part of the population that doesn't feel comfortable with these statues, what can we do? What can we do? And one of the solutions that has been discussed is, okay, so maybe we can keep the statues, but maybe the plaque that talks about the person can also talk about this part and explain that this person was not just a hero. He also had, it also, for example, had one of the figures we have here also had texts about how Black people should be enslaved because they had no souls. And so these things have to be also there, not only glorifying the character, but also acknowledging that there was a part of this character that really had another speech. and at the same time creating new statues that glorify, for example, other figures that are important, for example, for descendants from slaves. And so this is some things that are being, they can also be possible, only be possible when there's dialogue, when there's conflict management, when we sit everyone at the table and we try to understand what is the issue exactly and how can we make sure everyone has the chance to feel comfortable in their own city. There's also, for example, a controversial discussion about the movie Gone with the Wind, and the same issue happened. So there were people that wanted to take the movie out of circulation, and because of the slavery picture being non-realistic and very romanticized, and there were groups that felt this is cultural reference and cannot be taken out of the market because it's a very important movie. And only through dialogue could we really realize how could we find a solution. The solution was sitting everyone at the same table and finding and creating a cultural context before the movie, so that the movie is used for pedagogical purposes, to reflect about slavery and not to overemphasize an image of slavery that is not very positive. So as we can see through dialogue, many things can happen. This is another example, interesting example. There's this movement of Visible Wiki Women is a project by a movement, and they created specifically for Black women, but not only. What they wanted, it was to really tackle the misrepresentation or non-representation of women in the same amount as men figures in Wikipedia. And in Wikipedia, not only, but because Wikipedia is much used. And so they really did a campaign to collect the hidden history stories of many women, especially women from minorities, that had an important role in their societies, but are not being acknowledged in the internet. So the knowledge we now have and possess that we can access every time in the internet when we have access to it, it doesn't really, is not representative. There are figures that are more represented and we can reach easily online than when we talk about other groups. For example, here in Portugal, we had revolution against dictatorship in 25th of April, 1974. And I had a colleague, she's an historian, she was trying to write history of this moment. And there were references to many men and women participating in this moment. And she went to online and she couldn't find anything about the women that participated in the revolution, but could find many things about the men that participated in the revolution. So this is another example how also things, we might feel everything is out there and we know everything by the internet, but there's also things lacking in the internet when we go there. And other things might be, for example, here in Lisbon, there's an association, and also in Paris, I heard about it, and probably in other places they started doing that too. And they do what they call African Presence in Lisbon tours. So there are tours for tourists and also for other non-tourists that want to look at the city in a different perspective. What they do is they're going to do a tour, and they're going to talk about the hidden history of Lisbon, that history that normal tour guides don't talk about, which is things that were built by slaves, or where were the slave markets, or where, for example, was a major killing of Jewish people in Lisbon. So things that are not usually talked about in tours, and they need to be acknowledged as part of history too. So there are groups of activists doing this kind of tours, and I highly recommend it. I've done 6 to the Lisbon city already, all with different guides, and I always learn something in all of them. Another tool that might be useful is this Icon tool. Icon tool is something that started in Germany, and there's a handbook, but also a phone app with icons that help communicate in cases where people might not understand the main language that is being spoken in that specific service, for example. There's also exists posters for schools, for children also to learn the language and at the same time being able to communicate. And it might be useful. It's not a very complicated thing. For example, the Icon book is something like this. It's very small. There's always the app also, of course, the book. For example, in Germany, this was handed to refugees, mostly people coming in a refugee situation, but it can also be used for other groups. and in an emergency situation might be useful in the first beginning, because if I handle this to someone that just arrives to my region, I'm telling them that I want to communicate with this person. So it's also a very important statement. I'm not just waiting for the person to understand my language as soon as it arrives, but I'm also willing to do the extra step to really understand what the other person is trying to tell me. Okay, so we have a small exercise and we're going for a break now. I know everyone is tired of listening to me already. It's just too much time on the online listening to someone. So I'm going to just drop the exercise, and we are going to suggest that you fill in the exercise and then go directly into a small break. And then we come back from the break. We will talk about the exercise a bit more, okay? Okay, so being a bit late for a commitment can be 5, 15 minutes, 1 minute, 30 minutes. So we do have lots of different answers here. Next one. Knowing how to speak many languages means speaking 2, 5, 3, 4. Okay. Next one. A long meeting lasts 3 hours, like this one. 2 hours, more, 1 hour. Okay. Thank you. Next one. A numerous family has 6, 5, 4, 7, or 8 members. So different perspectives there here. Some people are still answering. Traveling a lot in 1 year is traveling 4, 3, 1, 2, or more times than that. Interesting. So I think it's this exercise. I always like to do it because it really makes it obvious how difficult it is for us to have the same view on the world and what's right or wrong, good or bad, so that if for one person 30 minutes is very late and for another person is 1 minute is already too late. I mean, we can see how misunderstandings and misconceptions might happen all over our lives, and how important it is for us to understand why 30 minutes is okay for someone and for others just 1 minute, and to really have that flexibility to understand that is, for example, I know many people that say all Portuguese people arrive late everywhere. I don't identify with that stereotype. And it's interesting because no one from the same country will be the same regarding also these issues. And this is important. Some people say, no, this is just Portuguese culture. For me, it's not, because I don't identify with that part. And so I cannot say that being late is part of Portuguese culture. Maybe we do have a tendency to be more flexible around times, but that can be a cultural tendency, but it's not a certainty that everyone will fulfill that expectation. So it's important to have this in mind, that even for just small, simple questions, how important it is and how different might our answers be. And now imagine if we had here things like, what's the right age to become a mother, or things like that are much more trickier than the ones we placed here. So, and we do have lots of discussions about this also regarding different cultural groups, about this, the age to have children or the number of children someone has. And sometimes this is a target of many discussions, and also sometimes they influence public policy, and public policy might become a bit ethnocentric when it's coming from a perspective of what is too much children or too many children, or little children, less number of children. So it's important to reflect a bit on these perspectives and how they exist, because to become intercultural competent is to master a set of skills and to be able to mobilize and implement relevant resources to provide these effective responses and demands and challenges and opportunities that are presented by interculturalism. So we can divide these sets of skills into 4 big groups. One is regarding values, our ability to understand, then our attitudes and our skills. And so all of this need to be tackled when we talk about intercultural competence, and they are tackled in different ways. The way we reflect on our values is important so that we can develop certain skills. I can have all the critical and analytic thinking that I might even be from mathematics and have lots of analytic thinking, but the fact is, if I'm still stuck in a very ethnocentric perspective, the scope of my thinking will be very narrow. So it's very important that all of this is tackled sometimes during the course of an intercultural competence training. Understanding has to do with not only languages, but also the understanding of the world, of different cultural perspectives, of different religions, of different historical backgrounds also. Understanding that a word or a statue might have a meaning that, for me, might not be so important, but for other people might be really, really important. For example, the other day we were discussing using or not gender or neutral language because of gender identity. And this is a big discussion here because the Portuguese language is, all the plural is always masculine. And so there's a big discussion because it means changing the whole way we write or talk. So it's very hard, and the flexibility to change for some people is very hard to address because they say, no, but this is the language. It's what we decided that's the language, but the language can change, And if some people are feeling uncomfortable, why not change it? And actually there are studies in psychology and in brain science also that really show that when we talk about, for example, in Portugal, if we say the president, we have to say male or female because it's not the same as in English. If you say a president or o president. And so this is very, very tricky. And actually our brain, if we only say the president as a male, our brain, we only see a male image whenever we say the word. So if we say the female and the masculine ways, then our brain will picture both. And if we use neutral language, even more. So it's very important to understand the importance that small things that, we have lots of people saying, but why are you bothering us with language? This is not important. And this is the least of our concerns. Of course, it's not the most important thing, but it's important too. And everything builds up to create an intercultural perspective. And this is why I never say the migrants. I always say the people that went through migration processes or migration background, or people who had to ask for refuge or asylum. It's important that we focus on people, and not on the tag, on a very specific part of the life of that people. Being a migrant is just probably a temporary status. It's not who I am. And so it's very important that we also understand that, and that so also to connect with that experience, because all of us can be in the same situation one day, and we would like to be treated as people and not as, as our situation at the point. Okay, so this is also important because for us to come from actually the process of becoming intercultural competent kind of is the same process of becoming less ethnocentric and more relativist, meaning that we become more comfortable with being uncomfortable, more comfortable with people being different, having different perspectives of life, and welcoming that into our lives, not only in a society, but also in our private lives. So it becomes from, and it's interesting because, as you know, when we had the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a counter movement called All Lives Matter. And this is important to analyze why this happened. And it's important to analyze that becoming more ethno-relativist doesn't mean annulling individual needs. On the contrary, it means that individual needs can be expressed. And the fact that there are people that felt the need of creating a movement called Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that all lives doesn't matter. It means that we need to reinforce the importance of Black lives because we feel that they are being menaced. So it's a specific need for a specific group. One thing doesn't annul the other. But the movement called All Lives Matter kind of created an effect of minimization of the needs of a specific group, saying you're not special, you don't have a special need, you don't have the right to have a special need. And this was understood in a very intense way by Black Lives activists, because there has to be space in an intercultural place for people to express their own specific needs, and I have to open that space, recognizing that I cannot know what it is to be a Black person living in Portugal. I have no idea what it is. I cannot have it. And so I need to listen. If there's a movement coming there's a reason behind it. People are insatisfied. They might feel excluded, they might feel discriminated, they might feel in danger somehow. And so we need to create space for this. And minimizing this need is not an intercultural perspective. It's not being intercultural competent, because because their need doesn't have to know mine, but we have to have space to listen to it without saying, no, you're saying that, but all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter. I mean, one thing doesn't have to do with the other. But this isn't a very good example of minimizing and creating this idea. For example, I have many people I know saying things like, I don't see color, or everyone is the same for me. This is not true. No one is the same. And we do see color, unless we are blind or colorblind, and we see colors in a different way. But so we all see colors, and color matters. It matters. We know it matters. It mattered in the past, and it matters today. So by saying that, we're annulling the possibility of a person saying, no, my color matters because it influenced the way I'm able to live my life. And so we have to be aware that saying everyone is the same is not intercultural. It's not what we mean by interculturality. So it means that we do recognize everyone is different, and we recognize that everyone should have the same rights and the same duties, but we do also recognize that there are privileges and that discrimination exists in our society. We did recognize that only when we recognize that everyone is not the same. We want them to be all the same in terms of rights, but they're not the same because they're not equal as people. So it's important to understand that this is a path, and sometimes we do see things people say that they are still in denial, defense, or minimization stages. And we do want people to go through acceptance, adaptation, and integration phases. Integration, now we use the word inclusion more because integration might be confused with assimilation. And so inclusion is the word that is more used now. But this, at the time of 1986, integration was still the word that was used, and sometimes it's also used. It depends on the way we define it more than the word itself, but we need to be aware sometimes. And why are intercultural competences important? Well, first of the issues I want to say is that sometimes most of the people think they're more inclusive than what they really are. I mean, it's something that we don't like to think bad things about ourselves, and this is a good thing. We need to keep our self-esteem. But this also prevents us sometimes from thinking that we might have not acted the best way in certain situations. And sometimes we do that unconsciously because we don't have enough information, or because we see everyone around us doing the same thing. So our brain kind of connects that it's okay. But it's very important to really become intercultural competent, to stop and reflect about ourselves and the way we contribute to the pyramid of hate, many times without knowing or without intention. But this pyramid, I don't know if you heard about it, but it was built after the World War II to really understand how could what they called common people, being brought to a place where they were being at least compliant with genocide. And so this was, from the psychological point of view, very interesting to understand. How can this happen? A person that was a good neighbor, treated everyone very well, suddenly is participating in genocide. And the pyramid kind of helps explain how things build up in a society, and how we create a basis of prejudiced attitudes that create a fertile ground for the other more serious forms of discrimination start arising in a society, especially if there's a crisis. Or, for example, World War II, we know had a big impulse of World War I aftermath, where, there was a depression and people had no income or didn't have a chance to have a quality of life. All of this influence, this fertile ground. But the fertile ground needs to exist so that genocide can happen one day. We hope not. But the thing is that we do all contribute to this fertile ground by accepting stereotypes, not challenging blatant jokes, scapegoating, or whatever it is, or not speaking up when we see something happening that it's not fair. So we do create this fertile ground where then more extreme positions can start growing. And so this is, I think, the idea of a pyramid really helps us understand how this happens. If you are interested in this psychological part of of things, there's a really interesting book called The Science of Hate, and really explains a bit how an every common person can come to commit extreme acts of violence. Of course, there's a lot of factors going in there for the person to be able to reach that point. But the fact is that most of these people were not that different maybe from us at the beginning, before all of these factors. So we are all humans, even people that commit genocide or commit murder or hate murders or hate crimes are people, you know, their feelings and their prejudice build up in a way that was so extreme that made them commit violence. But to understand that we all do promote this fertile ground that's there, you know, somehow we all have kind of accountability to the process, although we're not shooting the gun ourselves. And this is important also to understand how things build up together, what we call the discrimination chain. So we do first start by making generalizations based on assumptions, saying all Portuguese people arrive late to meetings. This is a stereotype. And stereotypes by themselves already can have harmful consequences, you know, because I might not be so inclined to hire a Portuguese person for my staff because I think they might arrive late. So it might already in itself have a harmful consequence. But if I assign them to prejudice, it can be even harder. And prejudice are judgments we made based also on stereotypes. So they all build together. So if I have a stereotype that, you know, all Portuguese arrive late, then I can build the prejudice like they will not be good professionals, or they will not be good members of the staff, and they are disrespectful because they arrive late. So this is making assumptions and judgments based on my assumptions, and making value judgments, you know, saying it's good or bad, wrong or right. So all of these things without having by an ethnocentric perspective, you know, because what I do is better than what that person is going to bring. So arriving 1 minute late is better than arriving 15 minutes late, because that's my ethnocentric perspective. So prejudice really mixes our values or what we think is right and makes judgments about other people's behaviors based on that. And all of this together can lead to a discriminatory behavior. So discrimination only happens when we have a behavior. So if stereotypes and prejudice happen in my head, they can influence my behavior unintentionally many times, you know, but the first two happen in my head. And sometimes we can see by the things I say that they are there. But discrimination means that I act on it. If I don't hire a Portuguese person because they arrive late, and I think they will arrive late, and I think this means that being disrespectful or not professional enough, if I don't hire them based on that, then I'm discriminating. So this is, I like to talk about the chain because sometimes we talk about these things separately and they all work interconnected. So I cannot change discriminatory behavior if I don't have a chance to reflect on my stereotypes and prejudice. If I don't question my certainties about certain groups, I will always have the tendency to discriminate, even if it's micro-discrimination. And this micro-discrimination is very interesting because, you know, most people I speak with, they have never really done discrimination like it appears in the law, you know, saying that I will prevent someone from, you know, enrolling into school or something. But if I'm a teacher and I really enroll everyone in my class, but then I treat my students differently, even if it's slightly because of the way I look or because I do call more of them to the board or to do exercise and the others not so much, then I'm doing micro-discrimination. I'm doing small everyday behaviors that show that I have a prejudice, that I have stereotypes. So stereotypes and prejudice, if they are unconscious, they will influence my behavior in a very, very slightly and unconscious way, but that can be dangerous because as we see in the pyramid, these everyday micro-discriminations, they build the fertile ground. You know, they build the fertile ground that any other more serious forms of discrimination can grow from. And actually, there's a very interesting process in psychology called self-fulfilling prophecies. So when we have stereotypes that are very well embedded in my head, and I do have a group of people that think the same, we can make it, sometimes we do act in a way that reinforces that behavior so that the groups I'm talking to will start behaving that way too, because it's what expected of them. And they will reinforce a prejudice. And I will say, oh, I knew Portuguese people are always late because they started behaving that way, because I actually promoted that behavior somehow unconsciously. So it's very interesting how this works, because no one acts alone. We are interdependent. We are humans. We connect to each other. And when we are, for example, in a workplace, the behavior of one person will influence the behavior of the other person. So it's not that just the person will arrive late because of this or that. I might have also done something that reinforced that behavior because of my stereotypes and prejudice. So it's important to really understand that, you know, and especially when we are children, we are very permeable to this sort of messages of what I'm supposed to be, how I'm supposed to behave. And if I'm transmitted these images, for example, I work with a group of young people that are not working or studying, and they're all over 18, and most of them didn't finish mandatory school, which is 12 years for Portugal. And many of them work in precarious jobs or jobs that don't fulfill their expectations or their dreams. And we started working with them, and one of the first things they told us was none of them ever imagined they were going to university or something. And they said this very important sentence. They said, this is not for me. Going to the university is not for me. And we asked them, why not? And they couldn't answer. I don't know, it's just not for me. I don't know anyone that went to university in my neighborhood, and no one that looks like me I have seen in the university. So the university is not for me. And this is very subtly transmitted to this person across their growth and their development, so that it becomes embedded in what I believe is my identity. And it's very interesting. We did a very big path with many of the young people to get loose of all of this society expectations of the things that they were taught to by their education or that they see around them, for them to find their own path regardless of what they see around them. You know, for example, we had a Roma student. He was the only student in the whole university that was Roma. And for the whole time he attended university, he never told anyone he was Roma, because he said, I already feel I don't belong. If I say this, I'm afraid that people treat me differently, and I don't see any other Roma, so I need friends, and I need to have friends. And the only way I can create true friends is if I don't say I'm Roma, because then they will look at me with all this Roma stereotype framework they have, and it will be very hard for me to connect with people in a friendship level. So this is an example how microdiscrimination works. And no one prevented him from going to university, but he kept listening to jokes and comments about Roma all the time. So he understood very quickly from the environment that this was not a welcoming environment. So he felt the need to hide the fact that it was Roma. So why is this all important, and especially important also in the posture of whoever is conducting the training. So when we organize a training, either for the trainers or also the organization that's promoting the training, there are certain things we might do that are very important, and will very quickly transmit the message that we have an inclusive intention. And this means also by the way we prepare the training. Are we sure everyone can really attend the training in the same conditions? Because sometimes we do make assumptions about the best schedule, the best days, the best amount of hours, but we really didn't ask our target groups what was their needs. And we will have lots of different ideas probably. Maybe we'll have single parents that might prefer doing it in a specific day, or we might have people that are freelance that might want to do it in another day. So it might not be easy to find the best and the solution that will please everyone. But we need to listen, we need to understand if we're not excluding someone just because we decided these days or this schedule for our training. And the format on the tools we're using, is it excluding someone? Do I have blind people that might not be able to see the videos that I've created? Do I have people that cannot access the space or don't have transports even to reach the place I'm conducting the training, if it's in presence, for example? The language and the terms that I use. I don't know if you realize, but I've been practicing myself and train myself not to use too many terms that might separate me from other people. If I use lots of technical terms all the time, this separates me from people that might not be trained in the same field that I am. It's like being an engineer and come here talking about things that are not understandable for those that are not engineers. So we need to use terms, yes, but we need to also speak in a way that is accessible for everyone, for all levels of education, for all levels of understanding, and even people that might not understand our language. So the trainer needs to be someone that has this self-reflection and this experience on working in these kinds of groups. Also, from my experience, sometimes in this kind of training, people share things, if we create a safe space enough, people might share very intense things, things they think that might be more polarized, or opinions. And it's very important also to keep this in mind and have a trainer that is as expert also in conflict management and has a way of approaching these issues that is generous enough not to make anyone feel like they shouldn't be speaking what they spoke, because we need to have space for people to speak their own minds. But we can adjust, of course, if there's a very disrespectful issue coming up. But we do need to have this experience. It's very important. If it's the first time you're tackling this issue, I usually even recommend that we always have two people delivering the training, because sometimes I always said this to my colleague, we have different prejudice. So if I, for some reason, do something or say something that you might feel is prejudice, you just come along and try to rephrase what I said, and I will quickly understand maybe I should reflect better on the way I said it. So maybe having a pair can help us have someone that's always also helping us grow and become better trainers. And also because it's very exhausting sometimes. And the special conditions also. Usually what I do when I make an enrollment process, I always ask, do you have any special needs that need to be taken into account for this training? And many times this question never appears in enrollment forms, but I think this is a very, very important question. I once had a blind person in the session. I had no idea she was coming because I didn't ask this question. So it's very, very important we ask these questions, and we don't make assumptions that everyone will be able to follow everything we're going to say or do. And that's it, mostly. So to build this trust environment we need for the training, we should have a non-judgment environment. And this means what I say, being generous. All opinions are valid and important, but there's one thing I never do. I never validate judgments. So opinions are important, but I try to validate the feelings and experiences and not the opinion, because opinions, as we see, are very subjective, and some of them can be even offensive to others or to very prejudiced. And so we cannot validate the prejudice. We're not there to validate the prejudice. When someone says something that might be very prejudiced, what I usually say is, I understand that this issue might be uncomfortable for you, or that your experience might have been not very good with this specific group. And I always try to bring another story that is more positive about the group, so that the group doesn't leave the session only with that strict stereotyped idea that might be harmful for a specific group. As an example, if I was in a training and someone told me that all Portuguese arrive late, I can say something like, I understand that your experience might have been that, you with Portuguese colleagues might have been that, but I know many Portuguese people that don't arrive late. For example, I'm one of them, etc., etc. So it kind of invites people to question their certainties without also, offending them in any way, or calling them prejudiced, or make them feel they were also being judged. So we don't want to judge people by judging, because we all judge. We all make mistakes in this area, and so we need to be generous enough, but also invite people to reflect differently on the issue. But sometimes we need to start by validating their experience. I mean, it's their experience. It's not an opinion. It's a different thing. So we need, in also engaging people in interactive and immersive exercises and debates, it's very important. Sometimes let people discover instead of just telling them. You know, sometimes through exercises, for example, some exercises we might do will have people very quickly understand, okay, so I'm a bit biased. It's very common, for example, when I'm delivering training, that people enter the room saying, I'm a very open-minded person, I'm very inclusive. And in the end of the training, and it's just a 3 hours training, so it can be done and in short time. And if people end the session saying, so maybe I have some biases, or maybe I'm a bit prejudiced, then I have a win, because usually that's the main start point where we can work other things, because people need to open up also for change. And to open up for change, I need to recognize I need change. So it has to come first. And so to let people discover this, that they are prejudiced, is better than I telling them that they are prejudiced, right? It doesn't really work that way. They will be offended. And I'm no one telling them they're prejudiced, because I am too. So I like to do exercises to that each person can then draw their own conclusions on themselves through them, and they can share them if they want. But the fact is that I want to provoke experiences in people that will make them reflect on themselves. This is very important and really creates fertile ground for whatever comes next. Promote dialogue and mutual listening. Sometimes I have to manage very hardly the conversation, because some people might be monopolizing the conversation, and I need to have room enough for other people to express their views. And sometimes we also see there's power differences also within the group, you know, for people being more privileged than others. And this is something we need to manage very well, to be sure that everyone has a chance to talk and to bring their own perspectives. Provoke reflection and generosity, as I mentioned. And usually examples and short stories are very important, because as a trainers, we're not there to issue opinions. We're there to talk about, you know, science, and at the same time illustrate it with very concrete examples and short stories, because short stories no one can rebate. No one can say, no, this didn't happen that way. But if I say I think something, then someone can say, but I think differently, and we'll never leave the room. So I find that even for conflict management, when we have a very diverse group, using short stories and examples is very powerful. And it helps us listen to each other, because our brain is programmed to listen to stories more than to opinions. And because it's a survival skill, but also because when we listen to someone's experience, it's more powerful also for me to connect. And so sometimes when we have two people, for example, having very polarized opinions, sometimes it's important to just ask them, but can you give me an example? Or can you tell me a story where that happened, or that make you feel that way about something? And usually it really, and then ask the other part to do the same. And then usually the level of angriness really declines, because we are talking about a more human level. It really helps. And avoid engaging into one-on-one debates. This is sometimes some trainees might need a lot of attention, or might feel very uncomfortable during the session, and might monopolize the conversation a bit. So it's sometimes we need to manage that very carefully. So the training components should tackle the discrimination chain. We should tackle cognition or stereotyping by including information and data that might help deconstruct some stereotypes. But we should tackle prejudice and favoritism or biases by promoting dialogue and these experiences where people listen to each other, but also have exercises where they can feel uncomfortable enough to reflect on their own attitudes and prejudice. But also, we also have to focus on behavior, on discrimination, with stories and examples, and collect suggestions. For example, I always end my trainings with people saying, I always ask everyone in the session, so what do you think should be done for you and your organization to become more inclusive? And they will give their opinions, their suggestions, their ideas, but also with personal accountability. Because I always say, everyone is responsible for inclusive, not just the boss. Everyone is responsible for inclusion. It's not just the leaders of a city or a region, everyone. So we should all tackle our own individual accountability and responsibility. But it's also very important that we end with with some hope for the future. We don't want people to leave the sessions just feeling bad about themselves, that they're very prejudiced. We want them to feel there's something they can do to do better next time. But it's not enough for me to tell them what. They need also to come forward and say what they feel is the next step for them. So regarding formats of training, this is there are lots of formats, in person, and we have online or blended learning. In person has lots of advantages, but sometimes it's not possible or feasible, and blended learning might be a good chance to do it. Online, there is a synchronous or synchronous. Synchronous is like we're doing now, where it's all at the same time together online. Asynchronous is when we just send videos for people to see. And this can also be an interesting format, but per se, intercultural competences, just asynchronous, doesn't really produce the same impact. For me, there also always needs to exist an interactive moments where people can discuss, can debate, because intercultural competences are built in relationships, not in relation, not just everyone sitting in their couch taking classes online. So it's important to have these interactive moments, because this is when I will put in practice my competence. So if not fully in person is possible, blended learning might be an option where we mix asynchronous and synchronous moments or in-person moments. And different formats might be needed for different groups. I mean, we might have groups that are very hard to gather in a meeting, and we might need to have plan B or C. So if it's mandatory or optional, it's also a big question. Many organizations that start doing training for their staff question me, should I do mandatory or optional? Well, optional, usually my experience is that we're going to capture converts, people that already believe that this is an important topic. So if we want to tackle also those people that might not be so keen to change or to reflect on themselves, one way or the other, we might need to make it mandatory by the end of the day. So sometimes what organizations do is that they start by optional, and then gradually, after they've done all the optionals, they start doing mandatory for those that might not have attended first place. And this depends, of course, on our level of commitment to the subject. When I do mandatory, I'm stating this is an important issue, and this is something we cannot go around. Everyone needs to become more intercultural or become more inclusive in our organization, because this is our values, this is our culture. So it's a big statement when we say it's mandatory. When you say it's optional, it's not such a statement. We're saying inclusiveness is optional. So we might want to also be careful when we address this, that what we're transmitting, what we're communicating by making it mandatory or optional. Conducting a survey before conducting training might be interesting too, to understand also the baseline and the previous knowledge and attitudes of people. And then maybe we can do a post survey also. And a post survey can be done immediately after the training, but also 6 months after, for example. It's a good timing for us to understand if the training had any kind of impact in the daily work of people. So this evaluation is very important, because much training is done with almost no impact on how inclusive an organization becomes. So we really need to understand what went wrong and what we need to do differently next time if that happens. I also recommend also that we promote the more facilitators out there, because there's, for example, I'm doing training for Portuguese job services, and there are 4,000 people working for the Portuguese job services. And myself alone will not be enough to do that in 10 years. And so what I did was we chose some people that offered themselves also to become facilitators internally. And these had extra training. So I have 16 people that are trainers within the job services, and they received extra training to become also themselves multipliers of the trainer. So they can do training for their colleagues too, with my support on the background. So it's a way for also to, I think there's many advantages on this. One is that, of course, we can reach more people in less time. We can save money, and we have knowledge that stays in the house. For me, it's very important, because I come from the community development field, and so we always work to become unnecessary. That's my goal. I worked so that I not necessary in the future anymore. And that's, when we do our work well, we become unnecessary. That's a good thing. It might be hard to understand. And for me at the beginning it was, but actually what I want in the Portuguese job service is that they don't need me anymore. They have enough people in the house that have thought about this issue so much that they have the knowledge in the house and they can do other projects, other initiatives in the future. Because if I just keep developing training just by myself outside, then this is limited, my scope of action. I'm an outsider, So it's also interesting to make sure that in the house there are people that are developing their own knowledge further. And if, for example, in the Portuguese job services, these 16 people are now becoming kind of a consultative committee for inclusion within the job services. So they kind of become allies also of the leadership that is bringing the inclusion agenda on. And it's interesting because they are from several levels of the organization, so they bring different perspectives also on workers. It's interesting. So, and usually what I do when I do that, I also create a facilitator guide, something that will help people become more comfortable and confident delivering training. And usually they start delivering training first with me, and then only after that they graduate, so to speak, and do it alone. So just to finish, I just wanted to leave here the advantages and challenges of doing blended learning. And I'm talking about blended learning because, as I said, only online, asynchronous is a very limited way to work this kind of issues. We're not talking about, learning how to place the floor in your house, which is something that can be done online. It's a very important issue. And so it's important to have interactive moments. So blended learning has this opportunity to be learner-centered. We can have moments where people have more autonomy because they will be mixing online synchronous moments, so videos they can watch or tasks they have to perform, and they're mixing that with in-presence moments, either online or face-to-face. And so they have both, but they don't have all of it face-to-face. So they have moments they can choose, the best time of the day to do it, or the best day in the week to do it. So they have more autonomy, and they can better adjust it to their lives, also to their circumstances. And we can have diverse learning tools also as gamification and videos. And actually, there's many interesting studies that people learn all very different ways. For example, some people learn better by reading, some people learn better by listening, some people learn better by watching, and others by doing. And so when we do blended learning, we can have all of these mixed better. And for example, one of the very interesting things, I have a blended learning course, for example, on diversity and inclusion, is that I have people that watch the whole course one in a row. Some watch, every now and then a little bit, and some of them go back and watch it again because they need to watch it more times. So they all have different needs. So having that component might be interesting too. It has an impact on motivation, on time management, and also special needs. For example, it's easier to adapt parts of it if it's not synchronous for people with disabilities, for example, videos without a description or with subtitles. So all of this can also help, which is different from an interactive session. For a blind person, might be harder to follow. And also we can create interaction. If we're talking about interculturality, interculturalism, not promoting interaction between people, it might seem strange, because then we can learn by doing, by interacting, we can learn about intercultural interaction. And of course, the work-life balance and more time for discussion and group activities. So if I have less time for theory in my sessions, because the theory is in a video that they can watch later, then I have more time for these debates, for this interaction to really happen. Of course, there are challenges, and these are the three main challenges of blended learning or online learning. The IT skills differences, the access to the internet, and the isolation that it might bring. For the IT skills differences, having IT classes before or how-to guides might help, or sometimes even for the access of internet, we might have places where people can come and watch the course or attend the course in our space, and then we might have someone that helps them with the IT skills too, or distribute computers or phones or tablets with internet access. And for the isolation or the lack of support, we can have collaborative group discussions, or we can also assign them tasks they have to do in groups, and they have to connect to other people. It's very interesting also to do that. Open forums in real time or Q&A sessions with the trainers. You can have lots of ways to prevent isolation from happening. So just to finish, I want to leave you some resources. And of some of them, Nicola already mentioned, but I also added here the ultimate guide on online workshops. It was done by Mural, which is an app for whiteboards. And also something for you to read about ethnocentrism that might be interesting. And I also leave here some examples on Coursera. It's an open LMS platform. It has lots of courses on interculturality that you can take. Interculturalism, it can be interesting. And the Learning Hub of the Aga Khan Foundation also has this free course on diversity and inclusion that if you want to attend, you can just go there and ask. So might be interesting also resources to complement whatever you're doing regarding the training on intercultural competence. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening to all of this.